Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Discussions in Depth Psychology, which is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I'm a graduate of Pacifica, and I am here in the capacity to really find ways to extend depth psychology in the world. And in order to do that, I am having a series of conversations with people who have something to contribute to the wider field of depth psychology. And so I'm here today with Joe Cambray. Joe, I just wanted to welcome you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks so much, Bonnie. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So let me just read a little bit about you, Joe, so that everybody knows about you, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Joe Cambray Ph.D. is the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Pacifica Graduate Institute, as well as a Jungian analyst. He's past president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology and former U.S. editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. For years, he was on the faculty of the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at Harvard Medical School, where he co-taught a year-long course on becoming a supervisor, which is something that we're going to dig into a little bit today, but I'm hoping that actually we'll find a lot of topics that are of interest to everybody in the depth world, especially, and in spite of the fact that they may not be planning to become a supervisor anytime soon. Continuing here, his numerous publications include the book based on his Fay lectures, Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche in an Interconnected Universe. Also a volume he edited with Linda Carter, Analytical Psychology, Contemporary Perspectives in Jungian Psychology, and a 2-volume compendium on research in analytical psychology, co-edited with Christian Rosler and Leslie Sawin.
That's actually in process right now. It's not out yet.
Okay, good to know. Right. Okay, and in addition, he has published numerous papers in a range of international journals. So that's an impressive bio, Joe, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with me. I know your duties there at Pacifica keep you very busy, and so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to converse with you about this idea of becoming a supervisor in depth, but also I'm hoping we can wade a little bit into some of the topics around synchronicity and also interesting and fascinating things like countertransference and the larger interactive field that happens in the therapy room.
Well, thanks. I look very much forward to getting into some of this with you.
Well, I'm really appreciative of the work that you've done, and we're going to talk in some depth about an upcoming event that you're offering at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and that is a public program which is called On Becoming a Supervisor in Depth. And that's a 10-week program that starts on March 3rd, 2016. And you're going to be teaching that with Lionel Corbett, who many of us know and whom I've also done a recent interview with, as well as Pat Katsky and also Linda Carter and Avedis Panagian. And so the four of you are going to be offering that. It's really quite a specialized seminar, I think, but I'd like to dig in a little bit to the topic so that we can let everybody know what to expect if they are interested in signing up for that seminar.
Okay. Well, for about 12 years, I taught a course on becoming a supervisor at Harvard Medical School, and that was to residents who felt that they didn't get enough training in interviewing, that their expertise was in the prescribing of medication, psychopharmacology, and they wanted more opportunities to work this way. That then expanded outward into a look at the way people were receiving training as a supervisor, and it was very clear that there was very little formal training. Mostly people simply repeated what their own experiences had been. And so based on that, the wish was to really create a whole program that would allow people to differentiate their experience of being a therapist from becoming a supervisor. The relationships are subtly different, even though there's a lot of overlap. And so when I arrived here at Pacifica just in the fall, I talked to a number of senior therapists that I know and respect and thought we might jointly put together something where each one of us could come from our own particular area of expertise and contribute to the building of that kind of program.
Yeah, that's, what I really like about what you just said is that you were responding to a need that maybe was not actually extremely overt. And in some ways, it's almost like you're working from the inside of that field in order for something that wants to emerge and to be able to and empower people in a different way to actually take advantage of that opportunity.
Yes, a lot of times people feel, oh, I have to become a therapist and I have to be in practice for so many years and then I'll move to becoming a supervisor. It's a rather linear pathway in people's minds. And my experience is actually it's better earlier on to help people once they feel a little more grounded in what they're doing to begin to develop these skills. They take time and they're certainly worth cultivating one's understanding and one's relationship to various theories. Because as a supervisor, when you listen to a lot of clinical material beyond your own focus, then you are almost inevitably drawn into picking up different lenses and taking a look at the material from, say, a self-psychological or relational, and of course a Jungian frame, and each one has something to contribute. So the act of becoming a supervisor is a part of one's own individuation in this sense for me. It helps us broaden our lens and sharpen the tools that we use for our practice.
And I'm sure that most people who have chosen to become therapists or clinical psychologists as part of the individuation process, that they are called in a certain way toward doing that. But maybe we should back up and let's just talk a little bit about what happens in the therapy room. So whether people are familiar with that, I assume most people that are listening to this will have some experience of either being the patient or being the therapist in that. But let's talk about what happens when you're in a therapy room and what the basic needs are for somebody to actually have the therapy experience be what it needs to be.
Well, it depends, of course, on what the needs of the person who are coming in. I wouldn't want to have a generic therapy for everyone. In fact, what I often do in the first 3 to 4 sessions is really try to find a way to develop a therapeutic alliance to make sure that there's going to be a fit and that the way we're going to work together is going to be something that I genuinely feel I have something to offer this person in terms of exploration. For me, therapy is about people more fully coming into who they are as a person. The focus should be primarily on the internal life of the other person, but it's in the exchange with the therapist. So I don't think we can ever be left out of the equation. And there is asymmetry, so that I pay attention to my reactions and use them, though not often extremely directly, but they help guide me in terms of the interaction. But the focus remains largely on what's happening for the client and what their needs are, not just the ones they consciously express, of course. There's also, through their dreams, through events in their life, we can see the way the unconscious is mobilized and activated and how it's expressing itself through their lives. And so we get some guidance and supervision, in my mind, from the unconscious of the patient.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting topic, and that is this whole question of the field that is talked about, that is created in the space between the therapist and the patient. Can you just share a little bit about what that field, how I guess maybe share a little bit about how we can perceive that field and even how we can talk about it, because it's maybe not that easy to actually articulate.
Yes, I think, I've gone back over Jung's methodology, and the more I look at it, the more I think that actually much of what he was about was trying to find ways to talk about a multidimensional field within the limited frame of our own sensory perception. So in other words, if you take something like amplification, that is, you bring cultural analogies and you put those up against images in a dream to create resonance and so forth, why do you do that? Well, I think the more profound application of that is that you're trying to catch what's actually starting to come into being in the interactive field between the people. So that it's a technique not for simply saying, oh, there's cultural parallels to this, but it's beginning to get a sense of what the archetypal field itself, how it's shaping itself, and what's coming into consciousness. In a way, it's like with cells, you put a stain on them to see the different little parts on the inside. And so in a way, the methods, the approaches are often in Jungian psychology about the third. This, what I would say, supervenient, that is, it goes beyond. So we have an interaction and there's something holistically larger that's happening between us that neither one of us can own, but that's the third that we're both within. And so you're trying to look at something larger than yourself that you're inside of. So this is one of the dilemmas in the art of therapy in my mind.
Right. Again, this is something that's completely invisible, and it's such a depth psychological concept. And the word that you just used really grabbed me. So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that word supervenient. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's an interesting term. The first real modern use of it was by Leibniz in the 17th century. He was, a German philosopher where we know him because of the calculus, but he was also a philosopher of mind, and he had an alternative to the Descartesian view. He thought that mind, what he called, supervened on the body. And in fact, it is an element of contemporary philosophy of mind that what's the relationship between mind and matter, or the brain and our mind? And that is that it's not reducible to the brain. It's not simply an epiphenomena that spins out of just our neurological interactions, but it's a holistic structure. It's the more contemporary word for supervenience in science would be emergence or emergent phenomena. Mm-hmm. So that the mind emerges out of the brain in interaction with the environment, including the narrative dimensions of environment. But that's really where, in my language, the psyche begins to manifest.
Right. Yeah. So I think what you're talking about is these principles, more or less, of psychic ordering that are present all the time. How do you begin to go about training a therapist, or if you are a therapist, to begin noticing what is emerging in that field?
Well, this is, for me, it starts back with Jung's Red Book and the great courageous act that he undertook by taking fantasies that were disturbing him immensely and entering into those fantasies rather than trying to seal them up or to move away from them, which he could have easily done. But despite his understanding of what the dangers were, he chose to enter. And so he sets a pathway there, I believe, that in a more moderated present form, we would talk about reverie. That is, I can sit during an hour and begin to watch what's happening to the contents of my mind, almost like I'm from a meditative stance, just watching what comes through as I listen to the patient. And when I do that, there's often a convergence between what's going on in my own reverie field and the deeper aspects of what's in the patient's story, often struggling to make their way up to consciousness, struggling to emerge into the field. So reverie then becomes a kind of analytic tool to begin to tune in, to listen to the actions of the analytic third.
Yeah. So this is really a depth psychological approach, obviously, to therapy and to supervision. Do you want to say a little bit more about what else would be involved in that depth psychological approach as opposed to some others?
Yeah, well, first off, I think we try not to look to develop expertise in a particular area. The point, in my mind, is if you want to be a supervisor, what's your goal? Is it to simply make that person be licensable and skillful in a particular way? That's credible, and that's a very useful thing. But going beyond that, I think, how do you help them become the best therapist they can be? Which is not, it's not a clone of yourself. That's one of the things that's extremely important. We're not trying to replicate ourselves. So a depth perspective foregoes the narcissistic gratification or the kind of egoic states of the therapist supervisor in this case, towards saying, what are we in service of? What's the deeper thing in terms of what's the supervisee bringing in? And that's, of course, a challenge to them, because many times, especially at the start of supervision, people want to look good, they want to present their best cases, demonstrate their mastery of theory and practice. But in fact, we learn most from where we're having the most difficulties. And so a depth perspective, it's just like allowing the unconscious in. Where do you have trouble? Where do you, stumble? Where do you fall? Those are the things where you're going to learn the most about your relationship to the unconscious and what's probably creating difficulties or impasses in the therapies you're involved in.
Right. So I think we're circling back around here, but what I'm really seeing as you speak is this how powerfully this really is an individuation process. To be called to be a supervisor and to actually step up and begin to move into that role, which is very different than being just a therapist. And I don't mean that in any sense other than to differentiate between the two. But how does one begin if one is feel the call as a therapist to step into that role, to become a supervisor and to actually, I don't know if the right word is oversee, but to collaborate with and work with those therapists who are just starting out on some level? How does one begin to set a foot on that path, do you think?
Well, there are several different pathways in. Of course, one is one's own personal supervision. What has been good supervision for you? What have you really liked? What have you not liked? That starts already with a sense of orientation. And I really encourage people to try multiple supervisors as they find who has the best voice. You know, if I think over the years, I've had numerous supervisors, both Jungian and psychoanalytic. And often what I found is that each supervisor has a particular area where they're really skillful, where there's a certain group of clients or there's a certain kind of psychological issues and problems that brings them to the fullest expression of who they are. And in those kind of supervisions, one gets a very deep initiation into what's happening for them and gives a window, well, how is that relevant for me? How does it fit for me? Then I think that once you have a taste of that, then you can start to study. There's a lot that's been written in the last 15 or 20 years on what is good supervision. And you're absolutely correct, Bonnie, that it's a different skill set. Mm-hmm. Curiously enough, it's not always the same personalities. There are some people I can think of who are extraordinarily good therapists in part because they work out of a very deep empathic connection often. But when they become supervisors, they're more therapists than supervisors, and so they end up trying to treat their supervisees rather than helping them as a junior colleague. I think that's one of the psychological shifts. For me, one of the great pleasures in doing supervision is there's a little more freedom to speak theoretically with supervisees, because you can go into the case in some depth and then you can step back out and talk about it from ways to understand what's just happened with the patient or what's just happened between us, let's say, where that might not be so appropriate in a therapy to step back and start to give it any kind of theoretical perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So one word that comes to mind, which often comes up in the process of therapy, is this idea of countertransference. Yes. And I know probably a lot of people that are watching this or listening to it have an idea about what that is, but maybe you could just sort of restate that in simple terms and talk to us a little bit about what happens when that begins to take place.
Well, yeah, I don't think there's ever a place without it. I mean, but there's a history of the study of countertransference that you're really touching on. You know, initially in the early days of analysis, it was seen as unworked material of the therapist or analyst that was getting in the way, and it was to be eliminated. So you went back to analysis, you analyzed it further, so hopefully it wouldn't interfere. Finally, after the Second World War, there was a turn. Actually, Jung was one of the people who first began this with the idea of a field when he wrote The Psychology of the Transference in 1946. But around 1950, Paula Heinemann came forward with the idea that countertransference might actually be a communication. That what you're receiving, that yes, you had your material that was getting stirred up, but why was your material being stirred up at just this moment? And was it relevant? And that began to open a door, I think, that we're still in the process of understanding how we are a resonant instrument in the therapy process, and that if we can attend to the way in which our reactions are activated, then we can begin to sometimes get a window into subtle unconscious processes. What often this requires that before you begin a session, that you first clear the mind, that you have to know what's really active for you. So before I go into a session, I may well take a couple of minutes and just say, all right, am I feeling anxious, or is there leftover emotions? Say, I got an email that disturbed me. And, you know, if I'm bringing that into the session, then that's going to be countertransference that interferes with the case. To the degree that I can settle myself down and just watch, I may have strong reactions that are activated, but if they are not the ones that I'm bringing into the session, then I'm more apt to be able to say, might they be relevant here? And if so, how? So then it becomes a process of digesting that countertransference. Not saying, oh, you just stirred this in me. I'm not an advocate of the projective identification model. Mm-hmm. That is, you put this into me. I think it's more interactive than that.
Right.
And it's my responsibility to get hold of my piece of it.
Right. Yes, and that makes me think it's more emergent too. There's something that's happening in that space. Again, it brings us back to sort of that third space where something different than you and different than me is actually taking place.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the places where that's extraordinarily interesting, at least from my perspective in terms of supervision research, is what's called parallel process. I mean, the name's a little bit of a misnomer, but the idea is that a therapist is struggling with something with the patient, and they present that patient to a supervisor, and there is a subtle reenactment, sometimes not literally, but in a more metaphoric form, of the same kind of dilemma between the supervisee and the supervisor. And so at that point, recognizing the parallels that are going on there becomes often the key to working it through, first at the level of the supervision, which then often frees the therapist to then, and I've seen that happen repeatedly, that once somebody becomes aware of this in the supervisory process, the problem with the patient magically dissolves.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the opportunities then for us as depth therapists and for the field itself to actually have some kind of dialogue or interaction then becomes ever stronger as we begin to pay attention to it more and more.
Yeah. And that, this goes back to Jung, that you cannot change without being changed yourself. That you're one of the chemical substances, as it were, in the process. And that requires a lot of stress on the therapist and on the supervisor, because we are all conservative at some fundamental level in terms of our cellular structure, as it were. And so opening oneself up to change, really allowing that to take hold, where you don't know what change is going to happen, where you're going to go, there's an act of courage in there, I think. And it's very important when people take this on, that they realize going into the unknown, going into the uncertain, it is a kind of hero's journey in a way.
Absolutely. Yes. And I recently talked to Lionel Corbett about a similar topic, and he suggested, in fact, the words that he used was to call it sort of a shamanic approach to doing things. And that is where the therapist has to take, or the supervisor has to take it in, digest it, and then offer it back to the patient or the client in a different way, and in a way that they can digest at that point.
Yes, I think that's a key part of our field. And so it requires what I might call objective empathy. It isn't just simply that we are empathic with, say, the ego of the patient, but with the whole of the situation, or with the supervisee, including unconscious dimensions, so that I most remember in my own analysis, one of my first analyses, when I realized that the analyst was speaking to a figure in the dream that was bypassing the ego, and it had an enormous troping effect on consciousness. I was sort of stunned to realize that there was a dialogue starting to happen in the dreams between the analyst and the unconscious, and that I was in part a kind of bystander in a way. I got much more involved as I began to realize that was the case. And it made me realize that the way we understand empathy is far too limited. So then if you take a step further beyond that to Jung's notion of a psychoid unconscious, a psychoid archetype, there is a way in which the structure of the world is intuitively informing us.
Right.
All
Yes.
the time.
Yes. Can you say a little bit more about that word? You took that word. In fact, that was my next question. And so you're already, something's happening here already, right? You're already tapping into whatever's going on here. Can you just explain that a little bit for people who may not be as familiar with that, or who may not quite feel like they have a grasp on what that is? And then we'll see if it expands further.
Yeah, I've been very interested recently in what I would call artistic intuition of the psychoid. And what I mean by that is, I look back in history. I was looking at some 13th century mosques in Isfahan, Iran, and they have these extraordinarily elaborate geometric patterns on the inside. It turns out those patterns could not be worked out by any of the simple geometric tools we have. And in fact, they weren't replicated by Western mathematics and science until really into the 1970s and 80s. So that 500 years prior to any kind of, in quote, scientific conception of these things, there was something about these craftspeople and their design that was so in touch with the nature of a fundamental geometric structure of the universe that they could represent these things. We still have no idea what the tools were that they did that. Another more recent example, Jackson Pollock. When you look at his drip paintings, there have been some people who've been analyzing the fractal qualities of those. And it turns out that he had spontaneously intuited a way to get at the optimal amount of fractal density on the paintings. You can analyze. In fact, there's even this one study that proved something was a fraud because it was off. It was significantly off from what he was actually doing at the time.
Yes.
And so it's that kind of artistic sense of knowing something in nature, not through a kind of cognitive rational process, but through this kind of intuitive, holistic grasp of it that I'm talking about. Countertransference often is that quality.
Yes, I've heard, in fact, something similar about Van Gogh in his painting Starry Night, that it was reflecting literally some of the patterns that exist scientifically and in nature.
Yeah, the turbulence patterns.
Yeah. So it seems like a real key, both for being a therapist and for stepping into that supervisory position, is really that capacity to begin to intuit. And I really like your expression, artistic intuition, because I think that sums up very much what it is that's happening in that depth field. Everybody is an artist on some level.
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm sure that therapy and supervision, when you really get deeply into them, are art forms. They are not. There's no way. These are not science kinds of things. You can talk about manualized therapy and evidence-based medicine and all of this, but it doesn't get this kind of material.
Right.
It isn't there.
Yeah. So our time has gone quickly, and I wanted to still ask you just one more question. Maybe it's a good place to close, and that is, where does synchronicity come into all of this? Because you're quite well known for a particular book, which is called Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche in an Interconnected Universe. And I have the audio version, by the way, which I love to listen to just some mornings when I'm getting ready for the day, or when I just need a little infusion of something. And so talk about synchronicity and how that fits into this process of supervision and therapy.
Yeah, I mean, we're right on the edge of it from what we're talking about, because, for me, well, what is synchronicity? I'm still wrestling with my own. There are several layers of understanding for myself. One is the easiest one to talk about is the epistemological. That is the observed facts, because, you're in it and you see it. And I can describe things. When I go to complex systems, I can begin to see language that allows me to talk about the way the interactions create something larger, a holistic structure that I think our intuition, I would argue very strongly that intuition is that part of our personality and our psyche that has been sort of evolved in an evolutionary way to pick up patterns, and that those patterns we pick up are not necessarily causal patterns, that what we call synchronistic kind of comings together, we have intuitive capacities to know some of those things. Oh, somebody's going to call me on the phone right now. This kind of thing, that kind of knowing just in advance. And quite frankly, the more I do Skype analysis, the more curious little synchronistic moments happen when the equipment doesn't quite work right. When the unconscious seems to manifest itself, and often in a session that's been completely congruent throughout the entire time that we've been talking, and then suddenly when there's a certain kind of affect that's activated, there's a break in the communication field, and then there's a recovery. And if you look at that, there's something synchronistic about that. There's no causal piece that you can pin that to. I think much more common phenomena, quite frankly. Just in the Jungian literature, we've only looked at the largest scale synchronicities, the catching the bug and saying, here's your beetle and so forth. Whereas I think there are all kinds of, even the reverie things that I was talking about today, I think they have a synchronistic base. That's really linking, and that these fields are fields that have synchronistic dimensions to them.
It's really a capacity for an inner vision, isn't it? It's true, we don't see those connections on the outer level or a linear level as we may think of them with our brains, our thinking minds, but they exist. And so therefore developing more of that inner vision allows us to actually sort of see them somehow from a different perspective as they come to us, making those links.
Well, and I think it's a part of the fundamental structure of reality, actually. And I look at some of nature's solutions. For example, we have neurons that make a brain up that's all encased in one head. But there are lots of other good solutions in nature. Take social insects, where any one particular ant is, say, in an ant hive, is not particularly intelligent in any way in terms of their behavior. Yet collectively, it can exhibit enormous sophistication as a colony in terms of the way they behave and the way they evolve over time and the way they solve problems. And we're just beginning to touch on biological intelligence. And I think that what we call intuition is some of that kind of collective phenomenon.
Absolutely. Yes. In fact, you're tapping into something that's very close to my heart, and that is I have a huge thing for bees and have, in fact, did both my master's thesis and dissertation on this idea of a superorganism and how bees are actually larger than the sum of their parts. And I think this is very much the same thing that we're talking about in this case.
Form logic, yes, absolutely. That's a dimension of what I think we would call synchronicity. Then you watch swarms, the way they can turn on a dime and they coordinate. And there's no guiding principle. There's no giving orders. Let's all turn left right now. It's a set of micro cues between individuals, and that creates collective behavior in the most wonderful and mysterious ways.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for your time today. It's been just so fascinating, and I wish we had more time to dig into this. Maybe we can do it again. I just want to remind everybody that Joe is part of an upcoming public program on becoming a supervisor in depth, which is a 10-week seminar that starts March 3rd, 2016 at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And if people would like to learn more about that, they can go to pacifica.edu and look at the public programs there.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. It was really a pleasure to speak with you, and I love your questions.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright.